This week's Torah portion is Parshas Tetzaveh. In Parshas Tetzaveh, we see a special commandment to make a garment for the high priest who served in the holy temple, in the holy city, in the holy land. And that garment is a breastplate called a Choshen Mishpat. And that Choshen Mishpat was intended and created and commanded by God Almighty to atone for any perversions in judgment, meaning to say anything that was done wrong in the court process, in the process of accepting witnesses and accepting testimony and reaching judgment and so forth, and determining who's liable and who's culpable and who's not, and so forth. Any perversions in that was something that was atoned for by the breastplate, the Choshen Mishpat. And this process in Torah of atonement and the possibility of atonement is not a license to go against God Almighty's will. On the contrary, the Choshen Mishpat, the process of atonement, as with all the processes of atonement, are intended to give us hope, to know that we need not despair, thinking that we've been entrenched in our ways and there's no way back, and that things are just the way they are and this is the way the world is going, and therefore we can't change anything. So we might as well continue. On the contrary, we're to see that the fact that God Almighty is willing to forgive us, He's willing to wipe away our transgressions, is something that is available to every single human being. And that's an exciting and enthusiastic motivation to realize that we could change our lives for our benefit, for the benefit of our Creator, and for the benefit of our fellow human being. And we know that judgment, dinim, is something that applies to every single human being. In fact, the Talmud in Sanhedrin, when it lists the 7 commandments, lists dinim as the first of the 7 commandments, meaning to say that it is the foundation of the world. The foundation of the world is knowing the difference between right and wrong. In order for there to be a court system, in order for people to be held culpable and to suffer consequences or be shown the consequences of their actions, first people have to be dedicated to the service of God Almighty to know the difference between right and wrong. So really the fundamental first step of dinim is to have a system of making sure every human being is aware of his obligations and his responsibilities. And then you can implement courts of justice, which is a requirement on every single human being to make sure that there's honest and proper courts of justice in every single location. And the centerpiece of the high priest's garments that he wore on the holiest day of the year, and the holiest person, the holiest location, and the holiest time, was in order to atone for any mistaken judgments, meaning to say, we should not shy away from being judges. We must embrace the opportunity. Every human being who's suited for this must embrace the opportunity to be a proper judge in a proper court of law according to the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach. And to know that even though he could inadvertently make a mistake, because the divine wisdom is infinite and there's an infinite number of possibilities, and God forbid he could make a mistake, but yet God Almighty is actually understanding that we're human beings. And that's why there's an atonement process. There's a process of tshuva, and that's represented in the Choshen Mishpat. So the centrality of judgment, the centrality of justice is represented by this very significant garment worn by the high priest. And this also takes us to the relationship to Purim. Because in Purim, we discuss and we celebrate the incredible miracle that God Almighty rescued us from the evil plans of Haman to annihilate the Jewish people, and then to annihilate the entire Persian population. But the reason that he had to go to this great length to annihilate the Jewish people, God forbid, was because he was seeing that there was still some resistance in the form of Mordechai, a Yehudi, Mordechai HaTzadik, Mordechai the Jew, who refused to bow to him. But what was the process? What was the state of affairs? What was the state of mind of the world at that time and of the Jewish people? 70 years from the destruction of the first temple had come and gone. And now that was a promise, as the 70 years for the rebuilding of the temple. It had come and gone, and it was not be rebuilt. And people began to despair. The Jewish people began to despair. And Achashverosh, the king of Persia, took this as an opportunity to celebrate and bring the entire Persian kingdom together to celebrate that there would be no rebuilding of the temple, of the holy temple in Jerusalem. Now, this is not just some mere cultural difference that the Jewish people had certain cultural practices, and therefore, the Jewish people were not going to be returning to the Holy Land, and he thought, and rebuilding the temple. So therefore, it was something to celebrate. It's much deeper than that. The practices of the Jewish people relate to the very building and the very existence of the world. The world exists only when we have proper judgment, when we have proper courts of law, when we have proper inspired teaching of God Almighty's divine wisdom, and we have the proper follow-through, not only in the teaching, but to make sure that people actually do that, and to encourage them and to motivate them and to continue to do it no matter what the circumstances are. So the Persian kingdom was really celebrating that in the non-rebuilding of the temple in the 70 years, the world would now be relieved of this moral guidance. The world would be relieved of this moral compass and spiritual backbone for the world. And Amalek, which is the driving force of the recurring attacks against the Jewish people in every generation up to this generation, wants to uproot the concept of justice and the concept of dinim from the world, in order that they can then throw the entire world into chaos. And therefore, they were instigators in this celebration. They were instigators in making sure that there is going to be a general despair of the Jewish people. And when the Jewish people would give up, then the Jewish people would just disappear into assimilation. But when one Jew refused to go to the party in that celebration, and one Jew refuses to bow down, Amalek realizes that he has no option but to move in a much more dramatic and forceful way against the Jewish people. Merely let despair alone and giving up on the hopes and the dreams of the prophets and all the generations in itself is not sufficient to untether the world from the divine compass. So Amalek had to spring into action in order to reach its goal of destroying humanity as a whole, God forbid. It had to move into action to try to strike directly at the moral compass, the sense that there is a right and wrong, the knowledge that there's a right and wrong, it's divinely given and it's eternal. Amalek had to strike against that with desperation. It lost its patience. It lost its sense of being willing to take as long as it takes. On the contrary, Amalek had to spring into action and realize that direct action to remove the moral compass, the witnesses in the world to God Almighty's existence, was something that they had to do, and had to do quickly. And that's what prompted Haman's actions, to try to remove from the world that tether, that grounding in God Almighty's divine wisdom. So the lesson for us is to see the centrality and the importance of justice, the importance of proper justice. And to the extent that we have failed to do it, we have to know that God Almighty is willing and welcoming our returning to saying we want to do it properly from now on. We want to establish courts of law throughout the world that are going to be guided by divine principles, that are going to be guided by the knowledge that there's nothing besides God Almighty, and not merely a statement in the back of the wall, which is a good step over many courts which no longer have it, that it says, in God we trust. But it should be a feeling and a sense of everyone participating in the court system, that they know that this is God Almighty's world and everything in the world is created for His glory and His honor. His honor meaning not just the judges, His honor, but meaning God Almighty in His honor. So therefore, we have a tremendous opportunity when we come to celebrate Purim. We realize that the victory is, the nahafachu is that the moral compass of the world, which is the Jewish people, bringing to the world the message of God Almighty's divine guidance and loving kindness of instruction and mission and purpose, and that every human being is lovingly created every moment. That divine mission was renewed and increased, and the Jewish people were relieved for that moment in time of their enemies that sought to destroy them from the mission. And in the process of that last-ditch attempt to try to destroy the Jewish people, it thrust the Jewish people and it sparked a much greater commitment to God Almighty's divine wisdom, and a recommitment to influencing all their neighbors into observing God Almighty's divine commandments, and building and rebuilding the holy temple in the holy city, in the holy land, for the benefit of every single human being. So we do not need to be afraid of all the attempts to try to cause despair, and attempts to try to attack at the Jewish people, because we need to realize that this is just the last desperate moments of Amalek, recognizing that the world is waking up to see the divine wisdom, and to see the divine wisdom is found in every single human being. And we no longer need to be fooled to think that the divine wisdom is not available to us, and we can only know what to think if we speak with human experts. On the contrary, God Almighty is speaking into every person at every moment, and it's just for us to listen to his voice. And when we celebrate Purim, we have this gift of knowing, the greatest joy to know that divine wisdom is available, and we are here to be available to every single human being, to help guide them to find their own divine wisdom, to themselves become a wellspring of divine wisdom in every place that they are. And that is the ultimate fulfillment of the world's ultimate vision of God Almighty, that there's going to be a place when God Almighty is going to be found and expressed, and everyone's going to see God Almighty, that there's nothing besides him, and that everything is just an expression of God Almighty. That's what we're racing towards right now. And that's what we need to stay focused on. That's what we need to be thinking about every instant. That's what we need to be recognizing, that we are not just here waiting to be rescued, but on the contrary, we're here as the rescuers for every single human being. And when we recognize that we are the rescuers, we are here to be of benefit and provide the life ring and provide the life raft for all of humanity and for all of civilization, then God Almighty is going to respond in kind and lift everybody up and restore everyone to their spiritual sanity and their mental sanity and their emotional sanity and their physical health, and reveal in the world the tremendous abundance as the world's population increases from 8 billion to 80 billion and beyond. God Almighty will provide the abundance in ways that we can't even possibly imagine yet, that will sustain every single human being in great abundance with joy and happiness and an eternal joy. And that is what we're praying for, and that's what we're working for, and that's the life raft that the Jewish people are offering the entire world. And God willing, we should see it fulfilled. Everyone will see this, and everyone is going to embrace this idea. And those few people of Haman's descendants from Haman, that they themselves tragically are insistent that no matter what, and despite all evidence to the contrary, they insist on rebelling against God Almighty. God Almighty will make sure that they are no longer a factor in this great mission of humanity to bring the recognition of God Almighty to every single person. So that's how we're going to celebrate Purim, and we should be blessed to know and to understand everything that we can as a human being, and to know that when Moshiach comes, Purim is still going to be the only holiday. It's going to actually be the only holiday that's still going to be celebrated, because it represents it represents the fulfillment of this divine mission, that despite all the obstacles and all the generations, the Jewish people continued a great self-sacrifice, including giving up their lives literally, not alter one letter and not even one aspect of one letter of the divine wisdom, so that it should remain preserved and completely pristine for the benefit of every single human being thousands of years after it was revealed to humanity. It should remain pristine and ready for every human being to directly connect with their Creator. And God Almighty, we should experience this all very soon. Everyone should have a good Shabbos and a Freilich and Purim.